Spanish. Dave Tschirley is a professor in international development, also in the AFRI department, as I've mentioned, and co-director of the Food Security Group. Over 20 years, he's been working in applied food security research, mentoring of younger researchers coming up, and active outreach in terms of food policy. He focuses on 3 things. He's got a new project, probably not so new, but it's still new to me, on food, in particular dietary changes, and what are the implications of changing diets in terms of policy and programs, employment. He's also working on intersections of food aid, food markets, and emergency response to food crisis. And he also helps to link smallholder farmers to cash crop markets, looking especially at cotton and fresh produce. He's published all kinds of articles, edited books, chapters, and so forth, gotten funding from a number of prestigious foundations, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the FAO, the Inter-American Development Bank, and more. And he's also fluent in Spanish and Portuguese, as he's worked for many years in Ecuador and also in Mozambique. A warm welcome to our 2 speakers for today, and handing over to you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, everybody. It's been a few years since I've done this. I went through a period where I did a number of these talks, and then it seems like, I don't know, 3 or 4 years go by and I don't get here. So thank you, Cynthia, for getting me here, and Elizabeth for proposing it at the beginning. So as I said, we're going to talk about these 2 different topics. Me kind of broadly about diet change, especially in Africa, and some of the implications of that diet change that's going on. And then Cynthia focusing in on the work on grain legumes. The work that I did, am going to be talking about, is based on work from a lot of people. Tom Reardon, Suita Liverpool Tassi, Jess Fanzo at Johns Hopkins, and a number of other people. So this is not just my work, a lot of graduate students involved in it as well. And it comes, I'm not going to go through all of this, but it comes from kind of a series of analysis of secondary data sets, nationally representative across Africa, a lot of individual data sets that we've collected, and then just publicly, globally available data sets on diet change and so on and so forth. So it's not just one study that I'm reporting on here, it's a whole range of things and the kind of thinking. And so there's, I'm going to talk about what do we think that we know about diet change and its implications, and then what do we not know, second of all, and then third of all, what's the very broad elements of a research agenda to try to start filling some of those gaps. And it will not be completely comprehensive because it can't be, so there will be a lot of stuff that's left out of here for discussion. So what are some of the things that we know? First of all, diets in Africa really are transforming. It's dramatic, and we're seeing it in 3 ways. First of all, food is becoming more purchased. So when we look at East and Southern Africa, and look even in rural areas, about roughly 50%, with variation across countries, 50% of food consumed in rural areas of East and Southern Africa is purchased through the market, okay? That was not the case 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's really a sea change over that period of time. So the markets are pushing their way into all these rural areas, and that percentage rises to 60 to 70% in Asia, where the off-farm economy is more developed. Second of all, the second P, we talk about the 4 Ps, right? It's becoming more purchased, it's also becoming more perishable. So it's this kind of very typical, commonly seen as incomes rise, move away from staple foods, right, towards more fresh produce, more meats, more animal products, more dairy, and this type of thing. So it's becoming more purchased and becoming more perishable. So non-cereals are now, in these areas of Africa, 50 to 70% of the diets in value terms. Again, very different from what we saw 20 or 30 years ago. The third and fourth Ps are that it's becoming more processed and more perishable, okay? So the processed foods that are eaten in Africa are not all this kind of processed food that you see on the table there, right? Some of it is simply the fact that consumers, rather than taking their own grain and pounding it themselves or buying maize meal, in the store, right? It's processed in a very low, rudimentary kind of way. But yes, you're getting a lot of this kind of stuff also increasingly available, certainly in urban areas, also in rural areas, okay? In the peri-urban, semi-rural areas, you're getting a lot of the highly processed kinds of foods. And then finally, it's becoming more prepared away from home. So for example, Tanzania, Nigeria, 15 to 20% from the surveys we have of all expenditure on food is spent on food prepared and eaten outside of the home, okay? And in every single country that we look at, that share of food is rising more rapidly than any other type of food, okay? It's just, we've got an arrow heading up. So it's becoming more purchased, more perishable, more processed, and more prepared away from home. Really dramatic changes over the past 20, 30 years. What does this overall mean? It just means that all of these are contributing to more and more of the value add. The final consumer dollar of the money spent is being generated off of the farm, okay? So where production goes or where demand goes, production goes, where production goes, employment goes. So you're getting the employment moving off of the farm as well. As kind of typical with variation, transformation of the economy, structural transformation of the economy that we see going on in every country in the world. The second thing we know is that this transformation is, I guess I've already said, is not just an urban middle class story. It's very broad in rural and urban areas, Africa and Asia, and it's across the income distribution as well. It's among poor people. This is a really dramatic figure that we have. Each of these lines, we divided food up in these surveys into processed by perishable categories, okay? From unprocessed, low processed, high processed, and either perishable or not. So we had these categories of 6 different categories of food, right? I don't want you to look at every number, every line here. The point is each of these is a budget share of all the money spent on food, how much is spent on each of these categories. And then this is the per capita income level of the household, okay? So if we go here, this is the international poverty line, under $2 per capita per day, right? The key thing that you see here is that every one of those lines, again, this is the share out of 100% of all money spent on food, spent on these different categories. What we see is that every line among the poor is either going up fast or it's going down fast. Diets are really changing as incomes rise, okay? And in fact, they're changing as we've measured the diets, as we've categorized the foods, they're changing a lot more among the poor than they even are among the less poor, okay? There's, unseen, unmeasured variation for sure in here, but the point is we're getting immense change in diets towards more processed, more perishable, more purchased, etc., among the poor in Africa, all right? And of course, most of the population still is poor, so we're getting this enormous pressure on the system, okay? So as I said, the diet change has already occurred by the time a household rises up to the poverty line, right? Which means that this pressure is being brought on the food system, the farmers, the traders, the processors, everybody else, the regulators, and so forth, that this pressure is being brought on these systems now. It's not something that's going to happen in 10 years or 20 years. It's happening very much now. Okay, the third thing we know is that urban demand is very much driving the transformation. So even in East and Southern Africa, where 25% is officially, of the population is officially classified as urban, well, 50% of the food market is urban. Why? Incomes in urban areas are higher, number one. Number two, even though rural people are relying more on markets than in the past, they obviously rely less on markets than urban people do. So 50% of the size of the market is in urban areas. And so you can no longer separate access to urban markets, right? Whether this is a secondary city or a rural town or a major megalopolis, you can no longer separate access to those markets from incomes and eventually food security of farmers in rural areas, okay? We can talk about that if some might view it differently, but that's how we tend to think about it. So if you go to West Africa, And then certainly in Asia, you're getting up to 70 to 80% of the market is in urban areas. Okay, so urban demand is very much driving the transformation. The fourth thing, and there are people that will argue with me about this, and there's definitely room for argument, it's not monochromatic, but local demand and supply dominate. The fact is that 85 to 90% of all consumption in East Africa, East and Southern Africa, is food that was produced in East and Southern Africa, okay? Now, is reliance on imports rising? For some commodities, yes. For some countries, yes, but it's not as monochromatic as we tend to think. So for example, we just did this analysis from 2008 to 2015 for that list of countries right there. And we did two things. We first of all said simply, is the real value of food imports rising? This is based on Comtrade data, which one can download from online. Is the real value of food imports rising in these countries? Well, unsurprisingly, in every country except one, yes, it's rising, okay? Uganda, though, was more or less steady. But then we said, well, how much money are consumers spending on food, okay? And what is the share of imports in that, right? Because populations are rising, incomes are rising, expenditure on food is rising. So are imports as a share of total consumption rising? That's what we asked in the second column. Well, what we see is that in Uganda and Malawi, actually over that period, the share of imports in total food consumption was going down. In Rwanda, in Mozambique, yes, it was going up, and in Tanzania and Nigeria is more or less steady. So food import bill overall is rising. It's rising because populations are growing. It's rising because incomes are growing. It's rising because as incomes rise, food consumption diversity increases, right? And part of that diversity is imported foods, not just local foods. So I'm not going to say there's no food import issue in Africa. You know, there is, and especially for some countries, but it's a more nuanced picture than we think sometimes appears. Okay, so contrary to conventional wisdom, many countries in Africa are holding their own actually in meeting their food needs. Okay. I think I skipped over number 5 to shorten this a little bit. The sixth thing that we know are that cities are not prepared. Cities in Africa are not prepared for this transformation, this huge increase in flow of foods into urban areas. This happened to be taken in a wholesale market in Uganda, but you could take it in Soweto market in Lusaka. You could take it in the market in Ghana. I'm forgetting the name right now. Anyway, all kinds of markets. You can get photos exactly like this. Terrible sanitary standards, congestion, so huge inefficiencies, and so on and so forth. This is some of the worst, but there are plenty like this. All right. And so if any of you have wandered around in these markets, you know what I'm talking about. I had more on that, but again, I don't want to take up all of Cynthia's time here. So cities are definitely not prepared, and so, you know, when my colleague Tom Reardon started writing about the supermarket revolution, boy, it was 16 or 17 years ago now, right? It was clear, okay, this started in Latin America, right? And there was no question, there was a supermarket revolution. Supermarkets now have a very high share of the food market in Latin America. It happened then also in Asia, in the higher income countries of Asia after Latin America, but it started there, and so you get areas in Latin America where it's very high. It was thought at that time that it was starting and it was going to overwhelm Africa as well, right? Well, the fact is, supermarket sector has grown rapidly in Africa, but it remains, so for example, you go to Dar es Salaam, supermarket sector is dramatically different than it was 15 years ago. You went 15 years ago, like 2 supermarkets, super sleepy, nothing. You go now, there are 14 chains with 40 stores, okay, in Dar es Salaam. But you get outside of Dar es Salaam, there are very few chains, much fewer stores, and even in Dar es Salaam, you know, it still doesn't have that huge a share of the market. So 2 things are true. It's transformed tremendously, number 1, but number 2, it's still a small share of the market, okay? It has to continue to grow really, really fast for a long time to actually take over market share. So that was kind of a detour in that some people looked at the supermarket revolution as being a potential to solve this problem. We don't have to worry about these markets anymore, right? It'll just go through supermarkets. Well, not really. So yes, supermarkets are cleaner. There's no question about that. Food safety is probably better in supermarkets. There needs to be more research, but okay, it's probably better in supermarkets. They are growing very rapidly, but as I said, from a very small base, and with really no food planning going on. And so in other words, so now look at Africa, probably instead of 95% of all food going through traditional markets, now it's 90%. It's maybe high 80s%. And in the meantime, governments are still not investing in better wholesale markets and better retail markets, okay, which is going to take a long time for their share to go even below 50%, okay? So that's the problem. And then there is mounting evidence that supermarkets are contributing to the problem and not solve the mounting evidence that they're worsening the nutrition transition. So what is the nutrition transition? It's the transition, you start at a low income level, okay? You don't have the money to buy more than basic foods and a few non-food items, right? And so the basic foods that you buy are also healthy foods, you know, whole grains, legumes, and so on and so forth. You're not getting enough of them, but what you're eating is healthy, right? Incomes go up, you start buying non-food, yes, but you also start buying this whole range of processed and so on and so forth foods. You get this transition to a different set of nutrition problems, which I'll get into. So there's empirical research in the last few years that analytically links shopping in supermarkets to more consumption of processed foods, you know, controlling for your income level, other characteristics that you have, the fact that you're going to a supermarket, you're more likely to buy processed foods. It needs to be shown analytically, just stepping back, that's hardly surprising. Supermarkets are set up, the advertising is set up, the placement is set up, everything is set up for you to buy, you know, the most profitable foods, which are the more processed foods typically, right? It's not vegetables that are giving the profits, it's the processed packaged foods that are giving more of the profits, okay? And then being linked to negative nutritional outcomes as well, okay? So, as I said, this is resulting in a nutrition transition. So, the good news about the nutrition transition is that the old nutrition problems, they're not all, they're still with us, but they really are falling very, very rapidly. You look at stunting trends in Tanzania between 1990 and 2015. Well, okay, 34% is still too high in 2015, but it was 50% in 1991. And this figure by 2018 is down around 32 or 31%, okay? Wasting trends even more, you know, cut by almost half from 1991 to 2005. This is maybe kind of stagnated in Tanzania. The stunting continues to go down. So, you know, these are still big problems, right? But increasingly over time, there are problems that are more limited in geographical scope, more limited to the lowest income shares of the population. They need to be addressed. But economic growth, for the ills that it brings as well, is bringing this good, which is, you know, very across the board declines, with a few exceptions out there in problems of stunting and wasting, okay? And in the meantime, trends in overweight, in obesity, severe obesity, et cetera, are really going up. So again, this is Tanzania, the same time period. You know, the share of men that were overweight went from 15% to 23%, right? The share increased by 50%, right? For women, from a little under 10 to 16, increased by more than 50%. Obesity, you know, same kind of thing, right? Et cetera. So all of these are going, and again, this is, and I'm not putting the data up here, but when you look at trends in overweight and obesity by age cohort, and you go down to a cohort as low as 12 to 14 years old, or 10 to 12, I'm not sure exactly what it was, the rates of obesity go up as you go down in those cohorts, right? So it's an exploding problem. We know in Latin America it's a massive problem already, and policy-wise, governments are starting to try to deal with it. It's a problem that is not just beginning in Africa. That's the problem. 23% means it's not just beginning, it's already a big problem, right? And you have to add these 23 plus 13, that's 37% of men that are overweight or obese in Tanzania, okay? So, and then diabetes, hypertension, and so forth are also rising, so these begin to impose enormous costs on society. So you have this, double burden of malnutrition at the same time that you have undernutrition. You've got the overnutrition. I don't really like that word, but you have consumption of too much fat and sugar and so on and so forth. So these types of problems. The triple is the fact that among both of these groups, both the overweight, obese, and the undernourished, you're likely to have micronutrient deficiencies going on at the same time. So this triple burden of malnutrition. Okay. So kind of three broad implications, which I'm not going to go into too much in this. But first of all, we started all this work, this diet transformation, right, to move towards processed foods. We started it from the perspective of, wow, this is a huge agribusiness opportunity. And among the many things that Africa needs, it needs more business opportunities for entrepreneurs, right? They need to be able to start businesses, make money from them, improve their lives. So this was great. This is an agribusiness opportunity. Well, it is, absolutely. It is an opportunity, and we think there's a whole lot, to look at there. So, for example, are imports going to capture most of that growth in value-added demand, number one? Number two, to the extent that local firms, and we already know that local firms are capturing a lot, to the extent that local firms are, is it the big local firms that don't really employ many people that are going to capture it, or is it small and medium enterprises who employ a lot more people per unit of output, they generate employment? Are they going to capture it? We know that a lot of them are capturing it. Anyway, I'll say a few more things about that. That's one broad set of issues. Another broad set of issues, the massive challenges for cities and how do they respond to this, because the surge of food moving into them is not going to go down. Then this changing mix of nutrition challenges that I was talking about. The other one is food safety. Felicia Wu is not here right now, but she and now with Suida Liverpool-Tassi in our department have been doing, obviously Felicia's done tons of work on aflatoxin, mycotoxins, and especially aflatoxin in maize and groundnuts in Africa. It's a major issue, okay? And one of the things we're finding, unfortunately, is that some of these small and medium enterprises might be more likely than the large processors to have food that's infected with this type of thing, for reasons that we can imagine. But food safety, so it's on mycotoxins, bacterial safety, and then also the rising use of pesticides in fresh produce, right? So you get a lot of organophosphates that are being used that are no longer allowed in Europe and the U.S. To the extent that testing has been done, the levels that are found in fresh produce are not very encouraging. Okay. So what do we need to know about this diet transformation? So it's just a fundamental thing that's going on and with major policy implications. So I'm not going to talk about everything here. I've blanked out a bit of this to focus on the main point. So as I said, we know that SMEs these small and medium enterprises are responding. There's this quiet revolution that Tom Reardon talks about in the middle of the value chain, right? So for example, and this is just one example, not every value chain is like this, but in Tanzania, the largest processing firm in the country, okay, actually got out of doing maize meal because they couldn't compete with the huge number of micro, small, medium firms that not only were producing but were branding their product, okay, and selling it at a lower price. So you've actually had this deconcentration in favor of SMEs in maize milling in Tanzania. With something like wheat milling, where it's all imported into the ports and the big silos and so forth, that's not going to happen. That's going to stay large scale. But when you have local production of something like maize grain or you have local production again in Tanzania of something like sunflower for oil, right? Then you have this explosion of small and medium enterprises producing oil, okay? I started at 1210, it's now 1231. I already talked a bit about how these small and medium enterprises, while they generate lots of employment, okay, they may not be so great for food safety, okay? And Soweta, again, is doing, with Tom and others, is actually doing some sampling and testing of processed foods from small enterprises and large enterprises. Not definitive results yet, but they're moving in the direction which we would which we were afraid and others have said are the case. Okay, what are the obesogenic foods and how are they reaching consumers? I've got to put this up here. Okay, so we're used to thinking, you know, who here last ate KFC? You know, I mean, it's been years since I ate KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, right? But it's growing super rapidly overseas in Africa. And you get the Cheetos, that's a Simba is South African, Stony is, I think, is Kenyan, and a burger, and so on and so forth, okay? We're used to thinking about the nutrition transition and health problems in this respect, right? Okay? Well, that doesn't look so healthy either, right? This is the traditional food prepared away from home, and expenditure on this is going through the roof. Okay, expenditure on this is going through the roof. And then this one always makes me, you kind of want to almost laugh if it wasn't so, you know, startling. You can hardly see the man in his traditional kiosk because he's got all the Lay's, potato chips, and everything else. He's got the stuff that makes money sitting in the front, okay? So the point is that traditional prepared foods and traditional market outlets can be and are major vectors for this nutrition transition and the nutritional problems that are coming up as a. So this is going to be my last slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to. I'm not going to go into any detail on this. I'll turn it over to Cynthia. So there are lots of things that we know. Okay, there are lots of things we don't yet know. We need to do more research, right? We're on a university campus. We're always going to talk about research that needs to be done. I'm only going to do this slide. We need to have descriptive knowledge over time. We need much more longitudinal, sentinel kind of data about how food environments are changing, how the mix of foods in those environments are changing, how people's purchasing behavior and consumption behavior is changing. Simply descriptive in a detailed way over time. There's not nearly enough information about that. Second of all, causal. What's the relationship between the physical environment a consumer comes into contact with and the decisions they make about what kinds of food to purchase, and then what's the implications of that on nutritional outcomes, all right? And then second of all, we need to know what to do. We need actionable research. So we need to look at the labeling experiments that are going on in Latin America, different types of labeling approaches and what impact do they have on attitudes and on behavior. We need to look at market design, public marketplace design, and how can that influence behavior and so forth. So the causal leading into actionable. So I have other slides, but I'm going to advance past them and turn it over to Cynthia. Okay? Thank you.
Dave and I have been working since the 90s on markets in Mozambique in particular, where we started with research on food aid in the maize markets of Mozambique in the early post-war period. And so Dave and I have known each other for years, and we know each other's foibles as well as our strengths. And I was very happy when the library came up with this idea. And please go to the 4th floor on the west wing of the library. There's an exhibit on the food security history, the research here at Michigan State that complements the Road to Nsuka exhibit that is right at the entrance to the library on the main floor. It doesn't complement it.
No, it's no longer up.
Oh, it's no longer up. Sorry, you missed the Road to Nsuka. You'll have to go to Nsuka and check out things there. But there, you can still go to the 4th floor west wing of the library and see the exhibit on the food security research and visit the website there. But what I'm here to talk about today, and it's my love. In addition to kayaking, this is my love: beans, legumes, and the role that they can play in nutrition, in development. I see them as critical components in what we're going to be talking about as the transition. And so we'll move on to this lovely, aren't they gorgeous? Come on, these guys are gorgeous. Sorry, I like aesthetics. One thing I want to do first is set the stage. Legumes is a broad category of plants, but what we'll be limited to talking about today are called grain legumes, or if you're from the British Isles or somewhere else similar to that, you might call them pulses. Pulses equal grain legumes. So when my vocabulary flips, please forgive me. I am talking about the same thing when I say grain legume and I say pulse. And as you can see, there are lots of different pulses. This is only a sample of them. But the key ones for consumption and production in Africa are things like cowpeas in West Africa. You've got common beans. The typical dry beans are the ones you find in like Zambia and Uganda and Rwanda. You've got chickpeas in Ethiopia. You've got, who else is up there? Bambara nuts you'll find in Zambia and some other places. Pigeon peas, there's research, extensive research, and if anyone wants to know about pigeon peas, you're ducking Sig, but she's back up again. Sig can talk a lot about pigeon peas. Like she's as passionate about pigeon peas as I am about overall grain legumes. But 2016 was the International Year of Pulses. We had a year. It was good. There were key messages that came out of the pulse community, that pulses are nutritious, they're economically accessible and contribute to food security at all levels, urban, rural, high income, low income. Pulses have important health benefits. There's a whole range of studies. Pulses foster sustainable agriculture and contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And pulses promote biodiversity. And what I'm thrilled to see in the room, we've got so many pulse experts in this room that if you give me any hard questions, I get to toss it back at you all, because we've got we've got breeders, we've got food scientists, people looking at the linkage between processing. But this is one of the infographics they developed for the International Year of Pulse. It shows all of the documented health benefits, and there's still a lot of research on the health benefits of pulses going on in terms of the human biome, in terms of relationship between stunting and infant feeding programs. We had some recent research that said you give basically about a tablespoon of roasted cowpea powder on top of your typical maize porridge to infants in Malawi, you can have a significant impact on stunting, which has been one of those difficult things to address. But adds in, there are a lot of vitamins. I can't speak highly enough, and you will see pulses in a lot of strategic documents when they're talking about nutrition and the like. And so they're really valuable. There is biofortification going on right now for beans, trying to get higher content beans and seeing if that will have a significant impact on nutritional results for pregnant women, for children to address the iron deficiencies. But as one of the things that Dave talked about is this double burden of the diet transformation and what is happening in Africa. And what does it mean for pulses? Pulses, the way they're going is not the way that I think we want to see it. But what we'll do is see, we know obesity, non-communicable diseases are going. I think the next slide, this chart to me was just heart-wrenching to think about it. This is body mass index, which we know is associated with the measurements of obesity. 25 is typical. Where's 25?
27.
Right there. 25 is right here, basically, where the United States started back in 1980. That BMI is the current measure of obesity. You top 25 and you're in the obese. There are questions on it, so the actual number doesn't count as much as these trends. Look at that top line. And I did selectively choose, there are no Asian countries or anything on here. I selected South Africa. There's a great paper by Steve Haglade that looks at different countries and this disease burden and the trends over time, and he chose various countries to do this in. But if you look at it, South Africa is way up there in terms of women who suffer from overweight and all the non-communicable diseases that are related. The US is way up there. I think we know that amongst ourselves. But look at the trends. Here are a bunch of African countries. All these trends, every single one is positive. They relate it to income growth. Dave talked about this transition. But look at all of these countries. All of them are on a positive trend for female obesity. This is across urban and rural populations, but you will find it, as Dave mentioned, in rural and urban populations. This is not just an urban phenomenon, unfortunately. So I'll go back here. The other problem that Dave has mentioned is all the issues still. We've got better at providing carbohydrates to a broader range of people. But we still have not gotten good at crop diversity, and we haven't gotten good at the micronutrients, particularly for rural poor and children. And so we still have rates of stunting that are, I consider, unacceptable. So what we do want to do is look at how can grain legumes kind of address both sides of the double burden, as well as the triple burden that came in about micronutrients. As you saw with the health benefits of pulses, they can contribute. But our problem, and let me see if it's going to come up, our problem is consumption and availability. The productivity side, there are a lot of issues with getting more pulses eaten and consumed. And we do see that we've got high variability, and that's why looking at any one diet or any one country may not reflect the reality, because we have such major differences across Africa in terms of the consumption and availability. You know, in Rwanda, one of the highest consuming, actually, I need to check that 21 kilo. I think that was my typo, and I think it's over 40 kilos. That's a typo on my part, my apologies. And Niger consuming somewhat less, but most of the sub-Saharan African countries, if you look on an average, there's somewhere between 20 to 40 kilos per capita per year of dietary, it's contributing to dietary protein. So they're very important sources. They vary dramatically. This does include soybean as part of your consumption, but in many countries, soybean, in the US, it would be very important. Here, it's not so important. There's not a lot. Jim, is there any soybean consumption in Rwanda you know of? No.
Very little.
Very little. This is mainly common beans in Rwanda and cowpeas in Niger in terms of your consumption. What we've seen, and you can look at, there's a lot of work that's been done by Ekabodi and Meredia here at Michigan State. They did an excellent review of the production and consumption trends. I highly recommend it. I'll have a list of references at the end of this where you can check out the work they've done looking at the trends, seeing some trends that are flat, seeing trends that are increasing, but one of the problems is the increasing production is due to land expansion, which we know is non-sustainable. We need productivity enhancements in order to continue improving production of legumes. Land expansion isn't going to work so much anymore. If we look at trends in India and Latin America, particularly in terms of the consumption, but not solely, you'll see India is one of the areas with massive consumption of pulses over history. But we're finding that with consumption diversification, there's less consumption of pulses going on. So as people diversify their diets, where they were eating a lot of pulses, they're actually diversifying away from pulses, which may not be a very good trend in terms of nutritional components. But the other problem is they have declining pulse production because there are other commodities that are more profitable to grow. And that's where your market and food system comes into play, to try and get the food system operating to motivate the production of pulses and to reflect the true value of pulses to our communities. And so in Latin America, Dave already talked about the diet transformation that occurred in Latin America and lower consumption of pulses. You get past that first bump that Dave talked about from poverty to just above the poverty line, but once you get above there to the middle income, you're declining. Your consumption of pulses and your dietary diversity may start going down. I wanted to just put this up. This is work that stems out of work that Dave and his team did. This is actually out of a team in Zambia at IAPRI, some recent work in Zambia where they looked at the consumption expenditures, and this is based on consumption expenditures excluding non-nutritional components. So, I'm sorry, the beer isn't included here, for example. But what I did was I just kind of tried to get a look at it, and I didn't put up the slide of 1996, which I have, which shows what components are growing. Animal products. This used to be right about here. Veggies are growing, grains are shrinking, pulses are barely holding their own. So as the diet transformation is occurring in Zambia, they're not increasing their consumption of pulses. It's staying fairly static, and it's not great when you see the direction. You can imagine the nutritional impacts. Oh, and there's, where's the oils? The veggie oils, this one, the oils went up quite a bit as well in this transition. So animal products, oils, those lovely fried guys in the market, which, you know, look really tasty, but they're not nutritionally very satisfying. So, but what we see is how can we get increasing demand? How can we get more beans in the center of the plate, as my colleague Vincent Amanor-Buadu from Kansas State he was working in Zambia to try and make it so beans weren't just a little tiny accompaniment, a little pile on the side, but get those beans in the middle of the plate, right on top of that shima, right, you know, your amount of shima, the maize porridge, and the amount of beans, get them equal, don't get them decorative. So that was what he was trying to stress, is how to do that. One of the key areas we think about is prices. You know, if you lower the price of something, consumers may consume more, and yes, beans, in spite of what you might think, beans do have a positive price elasticity. They do income elasticity, and so beans, if you lower the price, people will eat more beans. They really will. There is a good relationship there. However, the problem is if you have rising consumption, and you'll have rising consumption simply because of rising populations, right? If you don't increase that production and you have rising populations, the pressure on the limited amount is going to be so great, and the prices are going to go up and you're going to lower it. One of the key problems on pulses, and I think, you know, Sig and Jim and others know this very, very well, the yields on pulses in general in sub-Saharan Africa are very low. They're generally less than 110 per hectare, unless you have climbing beans in Rwanda, and you can get 4 tons per hectare. Am I exaggerating? No. So there are avenues for productivity increases, but people aren't investing in them like they did in maize and in rice, and we need the research and the technology. Those are critical. So the other problem, and Dave raised this in general, is the market development. If the markets aren't developed, if you can't get product moving efficiently, quickly, you can't connect market demand and production, you end up with these problems of prices, lack of production incentives, poor productivity. But I'm sorry, prices isn't the only thing. And maybe you in the room will understand consumer demand, tastes and preferences. This is a key problem for pulses, and it's not just in sub-Saharan Africa. It's here as well. And I need to move a little faster. One thing that came out just last week, how many of you are familiar with the Eat Lancet forum? Yeah, okay. But at any rate, what they tried to do is say, okay, let's look at the production end, the consumption end. What's a healthy diet? Both balanced nutritionally, but also sustainably for our environment in terms of productivity, use of natural resources, contribution to the environment. Well, guess what? Bing, bing. Legumes is right in the middle of a healthy diet. It's part of what that more consumption of legumes and, all right, it's not a surprise, less consumption of meat and dairy products is healthy for the planet, but it's also healthy for us nutritionally. And so I did this. I kind of copied from the International Year of Pulses and did this on the many environmental benefits of pulses and started looking at all these things. And this was generated by the interest that the Eat Lancet forum sparked in me in terms of how pulses, if that's what's growing, as well as being eaten, it's healthier in terms of the environment. And so these are the type of things that are being cited. Yeah, I'm acting like pulses is the perfect crop, perfect food. Not everywhere, but it's a great thing to be growing. And a lot of these, what you've got is biological diversity. You've got tepary beans that are more tolerant to heat and drought. You've got the climbing beans that are really productive in the higher altitudes. And so the way they're generally grown with low greenhouse gas emissions, they fix nitrogen, so they add nutrition to the soil. I was trying to think of the verb for nutrition, and I can't, but they add nutrition to the soil because they biologically fix nitrogen, which when you grow them in intercropping or in crop rotations means other crops can actually take advantage of that biological nitrogen fixation. So, you know, these are great. They don't, in general, they don't have high water demands. It depends on how you grow them, but generally lower water demand than, say, a hectare of maize, a hectare of wheat. I deleted the slide that showed those because it was so dramatic, but it needed too much explanation. You add the crop diversity, you can have risk management strategies, use these in risk management. So I believe that the environmental benefits of pulses, when you pull them together with those health benefits of pulses, wow, you got an amazing combo. And there's been recent research, and I won't go into detail because I'm not able to summarize all the research on food security and the relationship with legumes. Some recent research just came out by Christine Sauer, an AFRI graduate student, along with other colleagues in AFRI, in terms of if you put cereals into an intercropping with legumes or put legumes into intercropping in rotation, how does it affect food security, which is the focus of the exhibit in the library, and found positive results on some things, non-significant results on other things. It's not always a win-win, but it's still, I think research like this fundamentally helps us understand these dynamics between soils and consumption and household income for smallholder farmers. And so we get to the transformation of the production system. We focused on the diet and a bit on the market, but if we look at the production system, and that's what this Lancet report did, it says we've got to change. The outcome is dire if we don't start changing our production systems to match our resources. And so this is example of a healthy diet. This is not necessarily what everybody should eat. Obviously, pastoralists in the Sahel are not going to be eating this plate to be healthy. They will have different options and different mixes. But what I wanted to show and have all of us kind of think about is, what does our plate look like and what is the average African plate? We saw the Zambian plate, where legumes weren't too bad on the Zambian plate. Whole grains, too much. Where are the meats here? Animal, fish, blue. Look at how small that is, and think of the Zambian one we saw where the meat was so high. So these are the this is what's being recommended as a healthy diet, both for the planet and for the individuals, and legumes stands right in there, almost as much as, say, wheat or maize might be in there. Really important. And so this graph, what it shows, you look right in here, this is the graph on legumes. What it shows is they had three scenarios: status quo, not change, and having waste. And waste, I'm not going to talk about waste, but waste is an issue in the food system. And then you've got healthy reference diet with half the waste. This is the percentage growth in production you need to meet that consumption in a healthy diet, if you're going to have it. And you look, the production has got to go up more than 200% across the world in order to reach that availability for the healthy diet. We're a long way from that, and our productivity is a long way from being able to respond to these needs. And so that to me was the striking inference there. So ensuring legume consumption, we don't want to go where South Africa is. I'm sure Zambians do not want to be challenging South Africa for king of the obesity range in Southern Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. How do we get these changes? And one of the aspects is clearly behavior change. But how do we get beans and legumes? How can you love them as much as I do? Or eat them as much as I do? How can anyone, well, there are lots of people who eat more than I do in terms of them. But this is, how do we get them from being the protein food of the poor to being, this is a cool crop. This is a cool commodity to eat. How do we do that? How do we change dietary choices? How do we get kids eating these? Is it changing to convenience foods? Is it faster cooking beans? Is it more prepackaged cooked beans on the market? Is it healthier fast foods? Is it get those fried bajas, get them solar cooked with minimal oil? I don't know. But whatever the answer is here, it's got to engage the private sector. And I think that's one of Dave's points, is try and figure out what is an appropriate role for small and medium scale enterprises, for the women and the men who sell their food in these markets. And then clearly, I can't say enough about the need to increase productivity, increase yields, increase the quality demands. Are we responding with the beans that the consumers want? Maybe everybody wants black beans and we're trying to sell them on pintos. Things like that is trying to make sure that the varieties available to the farmers are the appropriate ones for the environment, but also for the consumer demand. So we've got, so I have to step away from beans for a moment, because what I want to do is just bring this all together very briefly. We've talked about the diet transformation. We've got more purchased, more processed, more perishable, more food away from home. We've got rural and urban changes and demographic shifts with greater and greater urbanized populations in medium and large cities. You've got local supplies are the key, the flow of commodity between urban and rural is really critical, and that is a bidirectional flow. And market systems are just not responding in the way that's needed to get this going. Finally, well, positive role of grain legumes and the ideal diet and environmental benefits of pulses. I hope this has made you think about the diet and what we're investing in terms of research, and whether or not we need more research to help us understand these dynamics of behavioral change, dynamics of development to the market systems, some of the challenges Dave mentioned. And finally, I did do this little nutrition challenge in the discussion section. I can let you know the winners and losers of the nutrition challenge of these snack foods. Is snack foods the way to go? More healthy snack foods are one of the options, but we'll see whether these are more healthy snack foods or not. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cynthia and Dave. Lots to think about, from the whole food system to the beans on our plates. Now we have a nice opportunity for dialogue and questions. And just as a reminder, if you haven't been at our seminars before, the microphone isn't to amplify your voice. It's here so that the people listening on the live stream can hear your voice. So please do use the microphone, and I'll ask you to pass it for us.
Either one of you folks can answer this question. What do you see as possible policy recommendations that you would make on these? I mean, if I'm a local government official in Nigeria or Zambia, and this is all very cool information and very stimulating, but what practically can a person in that position do to influence towards this direction?
So, you know, one of the drums that I've been beating for a long time is for more investment in public marketplaces, but not along old lines where the government just builds a market and manages a market. Those are disastrous. They've been largely disastrous, right? So there needs to be more investment, but it needs to be done in some kind of meaningful, you know, people throw public-private partnership term around all of the time, but, you know, and sometimes you get tired of hearing of it because it becomes kind of a fad and so forth. But it's what is needed, some real collaboration between public sector, municipal officials especially, who see the need, who understand what private markets can do and understand private firms, understand also the risks that they impose, and can have an informed and smart partnership to build better designed public marketplaces, manage them better, collect the revenues, plow them back into the market and so forth. So that's one thing. And then some of the micro aspects of that, experimenting with the actual market design and product and placement of different foods and so forth to try to influence behavior. And then finally, and this is all kind of oriented towards the healthy eating side of things, you know, very late, but finally Latin America, I say late because obesity is already such a massive problem there. They're really leading the world in experimenting with much more rigorous, if you will, restrictive, not eliminating foods, but labeling, right? Very clear labeling. But private companies can put labeling on foods that seem clear, but aren't actually very clear and don't influence behavior, and that's what's happening in Mexico. But in China, in Chile, the labels are very clear and they actually influence behavior, right? Not massively, but they have a measurable, meaningful impact on behavior. So, you know, you'd like to see African countries start on this kind of thing before they get to the extremely high levels of obesity that we see in Latin America. So that's some of the many things that could be thought about.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be done in terms of nutrition policy. That it's a relatively new field in a lot of ways. It was kind of isolated from other policy discussions, and I think now it's being incorporated more. The other thing you see is in some places they are taxing some of these super sweet commodities. They're putting an extra tax on Coca-Cola and its gang. And so taxation, if consumers are price sensitive, that's one of the ways. But I think education is one of the key levers that we should have in investing in education of children. all the way up is going to be critical.
Okay.
Apart from information, that is what labeling is answering to in a way. For example, you were mentioning some alternatives, and I was wondering, when you go to an economic theory, for example, you were referring to processed foods and other types. But it's not that it's the same for every value chain. So if you go to animal food, you find all the alternatives you were mentioning. So in terms of understanding, I was wondering, why was it possible in those value chains and it's not possible in the value chains you were referring to? Maybe understanding that difference would lead you somewhere.
I'm sorry, why is what not possible in some value chains?
Because some of the solutions you are proposing are things that are going on in other value chains, like beef industry has developed processed food and whatever, and other products the same. So it's not that it's a characteristic that is general. You find some cases where the market was able to do it by itself, and in others, not. So why was it that the market was able to do it in certain cases and not in others?
Well, so in terms of doing it, the question again is what is it? But markets are very good at responding to consumer demand, right? I mean, unless policies are a complete disaster and infrastructure is a complete disaster, markets can respond. The problem is, what people are demanding. They're not demanding a lot of legumes. They are increasingly demanding, fatty, sugary foods and so forth. So one of the things I wanted to say is that information per se doesn't actually, I think, have a whole lot of impact on people. Increasingly, the globalization of information and ideas and values and aspirations. So people's concepts of what a desirable food is. Is a desirable food Cheetos, or is a desirable food a really great tasting bean or lentil, that's cooked up in a certain way? What's desirable food? And that has to do with taste, but taste is very subjective, so it has to do with lifestyle and aspirations and everything else. And private companies are also very good at playing on that kind of thing, and that's really happening in a massive way in Africa, in poor countries of Africa. So it's a matter of, it has to do in the end with values and aspirations, I think, more than anything that need to be addressed.
So could I do a follow-up on that? I'm sick, snap, I just said pigeon be lover. But I also am really interested in how, yes, globalization has brought us potato chips everywhere. I used to work in the potato industry. Promise you, potato chips are very popular around the world.
Yeah.
Crisps are everywhere and growing. But on the other hand, there is sort of also a response in people valuing their culturally, like rediscovering sorghum in some parts of West Africa, rediscovering bambara groundnut, at least amongst the middle class, in certain areas. So has anyone mapped that? Because that's kind of a counter trend that would be really interesting in terms of these indigenous healthy foods.
No,
that's great. You go ahead, and then I'm going to give an example too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good, I think of different commodities that have sprung up out of nowhere, and all of a sudden everyone's eating quinoa. That's not a traditional food in Ireland, where my parents came from, for instance. So it's not traditional, but somehow it got cachet. And the cachet in Senegal, they're eating a lot more domestically produced rice than they ever did. Before, domestic rice was considered lower quality. Now it's considered part of the heritage and honor. Can we do that with beans? Can we have heritage beans, which there's actually a website you can go to purchase your heritage bean seeds and to purchase heritage beans. Indigenous, there are varieties in Latin America, the same thing in Guatemala, where can we market the piloy beans as heritage beans and gain a market share? That kind of advertising, and we need that kind of savvy for these commodities, because that kind of savvy is drawn to the money, and the private sector is not heavily engaged, other than small niches here and there. But I think you're right, trying to build on this made in Mozambique movement. And what's made in Mozambique? Muka pata. And what does muka pata have? muka pata has pigeon peas. So, you know, those kind of products. Can we encourage that? I don't know.
And the other example in Senegal, I'm sorry, but I want to give an example, is where this rise of processing can actually have perhaps some positive impact. So in Senegal, you used to move to the city, you'd go from eating millet to eating imported rice, but polished rice, whether it's local or imported, if polished rice is polished rice, right? It's just a pure carbohydrate. Now there's been this rise with a lot of female entrepreneurs especially of, and cheaper packaging and processing technologies of kind of pre-processed millet, so that urban people can now buy this somewhat pre-processed, semi-processed millet and prepare the traditional millet dishes in urban areas, right? So that's maybe a better story about the nutritional impacts of some of these changes.
And you'll see that it's not always traditional dishes. I mean, they're doing couscous out of cowpeas in Burkina Faso, the same idea. Small-scale women processors are creating spaghetti noodles out of cowpeas. It's not a traditional food, but it is a traditional ingredient, and playing on that, and as you say, changes in packaging may be enabling a lot of new innovations at small and medium scale. And of course, pulses, by the way, don't have the aflatoxin problem, just in case anyone wanted to know. Other than peanuts, we got peanuts, but the ground nuts, but they're considered an oil seed, so I don't put them in my grain pulses. But they don't have aflatoxin.
The one follow-up, another example is soybeans. So I don't know if last few times I've been at middle-class African families for dinner, a cheap meat substitute is pieces. It's not tofu. It's just more.
Is this Malawi?
Soy. Ghana and Malawi. So you can find them everywhere. So you know, plants are cheaper source of protein. So there may be some room for that as well as this cultural.
I've really seen that in Malawi, the rise of soybeans. But then in Mozambique and Tanzania, for example, not. But maybe it can catch on elsewhere.
What kind of comparative takeaways can we take away from South Africa, the obesity in South Africa and the nutrition, especially when we look at the trends of supermarkets, we look at the trends of fast food, which is huge, especially in the urban areas. But now we are seeing supermarkets, especially like South African supermarkets, going into Zambia, going into Kenya, and what have you, and also just the fast food. And then these fast food places are not just urban, but they're peri-urban and reaching out of the urban areas. And also the trend of the black middle class or the African middle class getting larger and larger. How can we kind of use that South Africa as a comparative tool?
I think we can say that's where the rest of Africa is headed. If you know, it's headed that way to some extent, regardless of what's done, because some of these patterns you're not going to completely change them, but policy does matter. So it's headed to that extreme unless policy action is taken now in terms of taxation, in terms of labeling, in terms of, you know, social marketing campaigns that maybe help people decide different types of food or cool foods, this type of thing. That's what I would say.
Real quick, because I see a lot of people leaving. If you didn't sign in when you came in on your way out, could you please sign in to our...
Thank you both for wonderful presentations and really, just great presentations. My question is about this policy and your funding source. So generally, I consider USAID to be a less than progressive force in terms of the kinds of issues that you've both been discussing. To what degree are you being listened to, and how much is U.S. policy, where do you guys fit right now in terms of USAID, or even under Obama, in terms of USAID policy and the things that it is promoting in Africa? Are you guys listened to, or are you guys really kind of the outliers?
So that's a good question. Obviously, the U.S. food industry is at the center of marketing, oils and other things to the world. And for example, the U.S. food aid program has been a source of demand, key source of demand for a lot of these companies and so forth. So it's definitely a problem. We are talking about it. So first of all, USAID puts a lot of money into nutrition, right? So it has been more. Yeah, I mean, you go into African countries, there's much more money behind nutrition than there is behind ag development, right? Certainly Tanzania and the other countries that I've seen. Now, how much of that is going into some of these new generation, if you will, nutrition transition and obesity problems, and how much of it is going into the still serious older problems of undernutrition? I'm not sure. Probably more in the older, right?
Yes.
So I guess I don't have a clear answer to that. I know that there's a lot of interest. I've made a number of presentations to USAID trying to, push more research on this. There's a lot of interest. We've been able to do all of this research with USAID funding. I'm not really answering your question, but there's interest. That's what I can say. It's interest among the technical people, and there's a lot of money that goes into nutrition programming in AID.
Yeah, I think AID has shifted to much more nutrition focus, and some of that I think has been valuable. There's still a lot of stovepiping, and I'd like to see less stovepiping. I'd like to see there's lip service to ag nutrition linkages, but often the funding, we have to only have nutrition as a cross-cutting. We can no longer fund a direct nutrition project because we are ag sector funding. So that's what I mean by stovepiping, is you've got your ag sector, you have your health sector. Nutrition fits in health sector, and unfortunately, there's lip service to the connection and recognition, but that doesn't always link to your funding sources, and that's a challenge for us. Yeah.
So I'll take ask a question. So it just sounds like these legumes are just like the greatest thing, literally since sliced bread. Which I agree with. I adore
Better than
sliced
bread. The sliced bread is so processed.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's a joke. They're way better than sliced bread. But so I get it. What I see though, I see the constraints of the stovepiping, because you said, and rightly, there's such a great nutritional benefit, both for giving nutrition to those who are undernourished, but also bringing down the health problems of those who have obesity problems. The environmental outcomes are so positive. And if I got you correctly, Dave, are you saying that these kinds of nutritious crops can also solve some livelihood constraints through entrepreneurship and small and medium enterprises?
So the value added. So as I said, when we first came to this diet transformation, the whole story was rise of processed foods, value added after the farm. So the livelihood options, yes, on production, but what I was actually, my specific comment had to do with micro enterprises that produce different types of maize meal, that produce these pre-processed millet products in Senegal. The rise of juices, which don't have a great nutrition profile, but lots of this value added after the farm in processing, packaging, and marketing among small and medium enterprises rather than just the big industrial firms doing it. That's what I was speaking to.
I mean, it sounds like a win-win-win, and I know packaging can be a key to making nutritious foods popular and available, and I know we have great packaging here, so just to say, that's like a three-legged stool. Yeah.
I'd like to just real quickly, Rick, only mention, I did this experiment before you all leave. Do not leave that bag of Cheetos on the table. Somebody please take the Cheetos home.
We won't tell who took it.
For those of you who took the test, Cheetos, yes, they were the highest in calories, along with Lay's potato chips. No surprise, right? No surprise. The best, of course, was the roasted lentils, my own personal favorite.
Can we take those too?
I would prefer we open those up so I can taste that brand. No, the roasted lentils are the best.
Oh, just actual lentils, like
Yeah,
this
actual
spice.
lentils, and then the chickpea puffs, which I thought, wow, great, I'll eat the chickpea puffs, they're wonderful. Compared to Cheetos, they should be great, right? The chickpea puffs, they were much less, so 113 calories, or no, sorry, serving size calories. 130 calories per serving size versus 160 for Cheetos. It's not a big benefit, I'm sorry. But then you do have, and you still have really high sodium, not as high as Cheetos and Lay's, or the spicy lentil chips, the chips, yeah. But I just wanted, for any of you that are interested, I have the key in terms of what these things, I had some surprises as to are better nutritious snack foods like these a better option. That's clear. So sorry.
Moderately so would be the answer.
Moderately so, depending on some things.
One of the things you talked about was changing consumption attitudes. And at least my understanding, one of the biggest efforts to do that was with orange flesh sweet potatoes in Mozambique and other places. So one question is, how successful has that been? But also, have there been any efforts like that to promote legumes? For example, in Mozambique, you could find big posters that would say, eat legumes. I mean, we did surveys, virtually every farmer, every family knew that orange flesh sweet potatoes was good for, improving your eyesight. So I wonder what your comments would be.
Yeah, the OFSP work, the orange flesh sweet potato work, I'm very familiar with. It was extremely costly, the campaigns they had in Mozambique to get people eating, but it was a well-targeted, well-designed, I mean, they had the capulanas, the fabrics. I have one, if anyone wants to see one. The doce que dá saúde was its slogan, the sweet that gives health. And so it had a great slogan, it had orange, and to this day when I see orange, I'm sorry, I don't think Cheetos, I don't think Donald Trump, I think orange flesh sweet potatoes. Orange flesh sweet potatoes. That's what I think of when I see orange. And so iron-rich beans, they're trying to do similar campaigns with the iron-fortified beans. Now, the effect of the iron fortification may not be as strong as you might want it to be, but as long as people are eating more beans, I'll take advantage of a campaign to say eat more beans, it's good for you because you're not lying even if it's not iron fortified. But they're trying those are much less expensive efforts, and I think we need to track those. There's also a new effort at pre-cooked beans. If you're on Twitter, just this past week they were launching pre-cooked beans in sachets, bags, not the Tetra packs or in cans, in Kenya and Uganda, and the private sector producer was getting them to Tanzania. These are the kind of things that the food system transformation could critically add, is the pre-cooked beans. We need to follow these experiments, see if they're successful, and see what goes on. But the OFSP, they spent a lot of money. They did have significant change.
But even so, isn't it still quite a small share of sweet potato consumption?
But it started from zero, so when you go from zero to something, it's a high percentage change. Well, infinite percentage change, actually. But you do, it is. Yeah, but it in some areas, in Zambezia, was successful in increasing consumption. Yeah.
But scaling it is really tough.
Scaling it is really tough.
We need it in the U.S. too.
There's a question back here. Yeah.
On the survey. I'm afraid our time is almost up. Yeah. Do you want to just ask a quick, is it a one?
It's a good one. It's just about data. About the data quality of like when you ask about consumption. Because I mean, my experience from India is that the richer people get, the more they eat out, and we had like really big problems. Or we had the feeling there's like problems in consumption data because you just cannot really record what people eat. So just that.
So yeah, data is definitely an issue, and then one of the efforts is to get better and more comparable data collection. And for example, one of the things we don't know, you get consumption by the household. but the household doesn't consume, people consume. So for example, adolescents who might have some money in their pocket, what are they buying and eating, right? There's essentially no data on that kind of thing, so, along with other things.
What are they eating?
Yeah.
What are they?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, great discussion. I hope that we're all going to taste those roasted
Yes,
lentils in a minute.
open all those packages before I leave.
Let me
Except the
just make a
Cheetos.
couple announcements. I just want everybody to know that at the end of this month is the deadline for applications for African language studies. If you don't already have students, or if you are a student and you aren't already studying an African language, this is your chance. We have wonderful fellowships. It's a terrific opportunity. Come talk to us. Liz Timms is handling our class this year, so please get in touch with us. And we have if we don't teach it in the classroom, we'll get you a tutor. We'll make sure that you learn that African language that you can use. I think we see some folks who use different languages in their research and how important that can be. Secondly, next week we move to a very different topic. We will have Associate Professor Lucia Kibona Clark from Howard University. She's an expert on hip hop in Africa, and her talk will be Gender, Sexuality, and Hip Hop in Africa right here, same time. Please come join us. And thank you all very much for coming to Eye on Africa.
Thank you.
Thanks.